Became acquainted with this view in 2012 when I moved back to the Berkshires from Brooklyn to start an internship at the Schumacher Center for New Economics. 2 years out of college, I had studied history, I had studied sociology, I had studied languages. I was a passionate defender of public education. I was a believer in the ideals of our democracy, and I had become very interested in supporting and building stronger local food systems. But I had never really considered the economy, its shape, its size, its rules, or its import, until I came to the Schumacher Center. All along, I kind of thought that the economy was just those numbers that they read on the evening news, very intangible, incomprehensible, and pretty much something I could not have any control over. My thinking on the economy started to change when I started working at the Schumacher Center. The Schumacher Center for New Economics is a think tank on the hillside just below Jug End Mountain in South Egremont, about 2 miles away from the house where I grew up. And it was founded in 1980 by Susan Witt and Bob Swan, 2 peace activists and economic pioneers who are dedicated to building economic models that will allow and foster a more fair and sustainable economy and a more beautiful economy. Bob Swan had passed away by the time that I started my internship, but I have had the privilege of working closely with Susan Witt and learning from her for the last 6 years now. And Susan has a really beautiful way of describing and defining economics. She says, economics is nothing more than human ingenuity organizing human labor to transform natural resources into products for exchange with one another. And so thanks to Susan, I began to think of economics and the economy as not something that happens to us, but something that we can actually shape, and something that's much more relevant and important than I had ever believed before. And I also realized that all of those things that I cared so much about, disastrous and unjust wars abroad, poverty, food deserts, and struggling public schools here in the United States, they all had their root causes in the current economic system that we're living in. And I also realized that this current economic system, which we might call market capitalism, is characterized by very unhealthy and drastic tensions and divides. For example, Occupy Wall Street brought attention to the divide between the 1% and the 99%. Our global supply chains, which bring products across the entire world to us, divide us consumers from producers. And we can't see the impact of all of the things that we consume, use, wear every day. We don't know how the production processes that make those things affect the people and the places where they're made. And then in conversations about climate change and in global aid discussions, the developing world is divided from and treated differently from the developed world. But these are only a few examples. You can probably think of examples yourself. The example of the division between workers and owners, the division between urban and rural, between human and the natural world. These divisions I felt like were all over the place, and I wanted to find another kind of economy that didn't create such unhealthy divisions. The Native American activist and economist Winona LaDuke, who is a member of the Ojibwe tribe in Minnesota, has a very powerful way of describing this economy that we're living in now. She calls it the Windigo Economy. And in her people's language, Windigo means cannibal. So she's talking about a cannibal economy where we think it's all based on the idea that we can just keep taking without having to pay. And this, for some reason, this is the image that comes to my mind when I think of Winona's cannibal economy. Now this is, the idea of a cannibal is much more sinister than a cartoon from Tintin. But I feel like the way that in this case, this is a Yeti, not a cannibal, but the Yeti is running and causing havoc and upturning everything in his path. I feel like that is very emblematic of the way that our economy is working right now, where we are just pursuing profit and growth at all costs, really at all costs, even though we know the social and environmental consequences. We are becoming more and more aware of those consequences of this kind of economy. So in my work at the Schumacher Center, I started to think about what could be an image for the kind of economy that we want to build. One that was much more fair and sustainable. And as it turned out, the inspiration was actually right outside the doorstep of the Schumacher Center, and in the form of a 100-year-old apple orchard. So every day as I drove up the driveway past these beautiful apple trees, I started to take them as my inspiration for the kind of economy that I wanted to work toward. And of course, one of the reasons that I thought that the apple tree was a good symbol was that it's rooted. Apple trees have roots. So instead of a system of global capital where money and resources can just pick up and move on to another place with no regard for the devastation they leave behind them, I thought we should have an economy that is rooted in place, that takes its shape from the soil of that place, and that because it is rooted, cannot just pick up and move on, and must instead be accountable to the consequences of its actions in that place. Another element of the rootedness that I like is that with apple trees and with many trees, they actually have a number of reciprocal relationships happening. And at the tips of their roots are many, many fungi that actually are the things that feed the apple tree. So the fungi collect the nutrients and the water from the soil and siphon it into the apple tree, and then the apple tree in return feeds the fungi with glucose. So I liked that idea of a reciprocal relationship in our economy. And then finally, in this idea of rootedness, Wendell Berry probably puts it best. There's this idea that if you are rooted, you can become acquainted with a place, you can learn about a place, and then you can then make decisions based on the long term. And Wendell Berry says it best. He says that these long-term relationships, they all turn on affection. So I would like to see an economy where we can make decisions, economic decisions, based on affection for a place and for the people and the creatures and the communities that live in that place. And luckily, we actually live in a place where there are great examples of that kind of economy. We have, as the director of Berkshire's, I got to know many of the owners of local businesses and the leaders of our business community. And many of these businesses, like Susan Salou and her Rossenbrook farm in Monterey, have been producing products for our local market for decades. And Susan Salou, like many of our other business owners, doesn't just make decisions based on profits. She makes decisions based on the happiness of her goats. She makes decisions based on the health of her fields. Luckily, we also have a network of community banks that go along with these local businesses. For example, Lee Bank. And they've decided to stay in this era of big, huge conglomerate banks. These banks have decided to stay small and local and dedicated to our local businesses and the needs of our community. They are definitely rooted in this place. I mean, this is pretty special. You don't usually get to see bankers cuddling goats. Going back to Winona LaDuke, I wanted to talk a little bit about a seasonal economy. What does a seasonal economy look like? So apple trees, of course, go through the seasons, and they don't look the same every season. They are not dedicated to growth all the time. They go dormant in the winter. And then their roots start to grow, and then they bud, and then they produce leaves, and then they produce fruit. And so Winona LaDuke talks about our capitalist system is a linear thinking. So we're just going forward. But what would it look like to have cyclical thinking? And of course, the apple tree is a perennial. So what would it look like to have an economy that is not dedicated to growth, unending growth, but instead to being perennial and to coming back and renewing itself? And one example of this kind of putting together this idea of reciprocal relationships and also cyclical businesses is a CSA. So we are lucky enough to have the first community-supported agriculture farm in the country in our community. Indian Line Farm in South Egremont was the first community-supported agriculture farm. And the community-supported agriculture model is a great example of a system that is cooperative, reciprocal, and seasonal, of course, because it's a farm. But in the CSA model, the producers, instead of having this long supply chain where we don't know what happens along that long supply chain, we have a very short supply chain. And the producers actually are supported by their consumers directly. The consumers buy a share of the farm. They therefore share the risk and the rewards of that business. So they are tied right into a reciprocal relationship together. And instead of putting the producer at odds with the consumer, in the community-supported agriculture model, we are putting the producer and the consumer in a cooperative relationship. Another element of this image of the apple tree that I like as an image for our economy that we'd like to build is that apple trees require, in order to stay healthy, they need to be pruned. And if you want to preserve that beautiful shape, one that you can harvest from easily and one that doesn't break the tree, you actually need to prune the tree. So what are the kind of businesses and the elements of our economy that we should prune? What are the unhealthy elements? What are the pieces that we could just do without? I think it's time for us to start thinking about that and maybe stop investing in the fossil fuel economy and start investing in a more perennial and reciprocal economy. There's also the really crazy thing about apple trees is that you could have multiple different apples on one tree, because if you just plant a seed from an apple, you don't know what kind of apple is going to grow. So in order to cultivate the kinds of apples that we'd like, you need to graft that tree, a piece of that tree, onto your rootstock. So that means that we could actually graft new pieces into our economy. We could decide what kinds of products we want in our local economy, and we could support those businesses. And one example of that has happened right here in the Berkshires, and with many students from Mount Everett, is Entry to Entrepreneurship, which is a business planning program that Berkshires started a few years ago, where we pair retirees and current business owners with young people in our community who have ideas for businesses. And we ask those young people, what are the businesses that you would like to see in your local economy? We ask the old people too, what are the businesses that are missing from our local economy? And how can we work together in cooperation to support those businesses? And entry to entrepreneurship is just one example, but there are lots of examples happening in our economy, in our local economy and around the country. Finally, the last element of this apple tree image that I'd like to talk about is the idea that apple trees usually don't grow by themselves. They usually grow in an orchard. So if we are to grow a strong local economy, we're not just talking about our Berkshire economy. We're talking about many strong local economies, an orchard of strong local economies. And the cool thing about that is that we don't have to be the only one. And we also are going to be connected to all these other local economies, because apple trees are connected by their roots underground, where they're intermingling. They're connected by their branches brushing against each other. They're connected by the pollinators going from tree to tree. So that's the kind of global economy that I would like to see. One that's an orchard full of beautiful apple trees, and one that we actually shape ourselves. So it goes back to that idea of choice, and that we can actually shape the economy that we would like to build and that we'd like to live in. And that serves us and serves the environment. So I'd like to ask you to join me in imagining and creating and building this kind of perennial economy. Thank you.